And then, so as I mentioned in the intro to this lecture, from the conclusions, it usually raises more questions for future research and future experiments that researchers might want to do in order to really better understand these biologic processes. Okay, so now we're going to segue into different types of studies and analyzing the outcomes from these studies. So the different types of studies here are the cross-sectional study, which looks at a group of different people at one point in time. The cohort study, which follows a subset of a population over a lifetime that share a particular common characteristic. And then a longitudinal study gathers data from a group of people repeatedly over a period of time. Usually, like, the researchers will keep following up at specified periods of time for longitudinal studies. And then for a case control study, that's where there are two groups differing in outcomes that are identified and compared to find this causal factor that's, affecting the case group as opposed to the control group. And then there's a randomized controlled trial, which is when treatments are randomly assigned to people in the study to test the efficacy or side effects of treatment. Usually it's with, study drugs. Sometimes there's a placebo, and sometimes there's also the actual study drug that's being tested. For these randomized controlled trials, they can either be blinded or unblinded. And so if it's blinded, then no one knows what the patients are getting. If it's unblinded, then the patients have an idea of, which one they're getting, or also the research team would know what type of study drug they're getting. And then an experimental study is a study involving the manipulation of variables, which usually includes independent and dependent variables. And so especially in, I would say, the psych section is when they really like to talk about these different types of studies, more so than the biochem section. And also many of these, so the cross-sectional study, cohort study, longitudinal study, and actually all of these except for the experimental study would be considered in observational study, because really you're just looking at the outcomes based on what is already kind of given to these patients. For an experimental study, it's really unique because you're controlling all of the variables, you're controlling all of the constants that are in that study, and you're really, that it's only the independent variable that's changing, which would affect that dependent variable. For all of these other studies, especially because they all have diverse patient populations, you can't control for every single thing. And so that's why it would be an observational study. That you're looking at one particular thing, but you're not really changing all these other variables. And so that's for the different types of studies. And then I also wanted to stress the difference between correlation versus causation. So correlation is when there is a relationship or pattern between the values of two variables. So in these graphs here, we see positive correlation when both the factor in the x-axis is in the positive direction and the factor in the y-axis is in the positive direction. So you're just seeing that both of these are both positive. And so generally it's considered positive correlation when the r² value, so if they talk about correlation, they will give this value. They will often give this value, this R value, to you on the MCAT exam in the answer choices if they are talking about the degree of correlation. So when an R value is greater than 0.7, it is considered like a strong positive correlation. And if it's greater than 0 in general, it's considered positive correlation. When, like, let's say the x-axis is going positive and then the y-axis is going negative, so in the opposite direction, then you would have negative correlation. And the way to indicate negative correlation by the R value measure is when it is less than 0. And then 0 correlation, when it doesn't seemingly have a relationship with the values, is when R is just equal to 0. So those are the different degrees of positive, negative, and 0 correlation. But oh, and R is the value that's usually measured to measure correlation, whether it be positive correlation, negative correlation, or 0 correlation. So these values really help researchers determine, the trend for the correlation of two variables. And then for causation is when one event causes another event to occur. So causation can only be determined from an appropriately designed experiment. So like the main difference, I would say, between correlation and causation is that correlation is just looking at a relationship between two variables, but we're not necessarily saying that one variable is causing the other variable to increase or decrease, because you can't really say that unless you have this controlled experiment that you're doing. So when you're doing a controlled experiment, the results that you're getting would allow you to determine like causation, meaning that one event, causing the other one to occur, because you know that all of these other variables are being controlled and the only thing you're changing is the independent variable, and that's causing that change for the dependent variable. For correlation, that's with the observational studies we were talking about, where you see that maybe like you could see that like a sedentary lifestyle is associated with more obesity, but without like controlling for all of the different factors of this patient population that you're using, you would only be observing this association between the two variables, that you may see that, more sedentary lifestyle is associated with a higher chance of obesity, but you cannot necessarily say that the sedentary lifestyle is what is causing that greater amount of obesity, because you are not controlling all of the variables. I feel like this is something that they like to test on quite a lot in the MCAT Psych Soc, and they kind of do it in like a, I guess they kind of make the answer choices seem like, they can make it seem like you're saying causation, and you would know not to pick that in the case if you know that the study is observational. Like I feel like they like to sneak it a lot into the questions.